Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Michael Carducci, and I am very pleased to welcome you to yet another No Fluff, Just Stuff virtual webinar to dive into any particular topic areas. This week, we're talking about microservices, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I am very pleased to be joined here with Mr. Ken Sipe, a cloud solution architect at D2IQ. And let's see. Ken, how are you?
Great, man. Good to be here. It's
Oh, no. Is it
interesting
me or is it
times,
you?
right?
Who of us
What's
is
that?
not getting audio?
Oh, test one,
That
two.
is a me. So Ken, you do you here for a moment. I will be right back. I'm going to try to troubleshoot my AV setup here.
Oh, the times of COVID. That's awesome. I guess while we're paused for a second, I do work for Day 2. Our whole focus has been container orchestration. That's what I've been working on for years. I've been with that company for 6 years now. And have been working. I guess if we go, it's hard to know, right? It's hard to know when we start microservices. I was teaching Corba in the late 90s. Was in the SOA world for a while. Don't hold any of that against me. So, hey, Mike, you coming back?
Oh, here shortly.
Okay. COVID beard, yes. Watching some of the chat, we'll pay attention to that as well. I'm sure we're going to get some back and forth, and with Zoom, maybe we'll even open up some mics. I don't know. This will be a little organic. We'll see how it goes.
Well, I dig it. Let's dive right in because I know that distributed systems are things that you think about a lot, and I am increasingly thinking about a lot as well in my current role. But I want to start with this. Last week or it might have been last week, it might have been the week before. I don't know. This whole COVID thing, I have lost all track of time. I can't believe it's almost September. It feels like just 16 years ago it was March, but at some point in the dim, distant past, we had Rod Cope on the webinar, and he dropped an interesting statistic. And I forget the source, but it was one of these like Gartner or one of these sort of industry groups that follows these things. But basically, it was that 90% of microservice architectures fail. And that I don't necessarily doubt that, but I'm really interested in where you see some of the anti-patterns or some of the mistakes that people make. I want to start with the ugly because I think it's good, but the ugly doesn't tend to manifest itself until we're layers deep into a giant Kubernetes cluster that nobody knows how to manage.
So let me get this straight. You want to start with ugly, and you invited me on the show. I got it now. Turn on your video, Ken.
And that's why I just turned off the camera too. I hope it froze on something like really kind of something like that. I hope that's where it froze.
Yeah, we were going to ask questions, but yeah, I don't know that statistic. I don't, and without knowing, I don't know, its origin or its validity. With that said, I don't know if I personally, let me put it a different way. I personally could see some validity that a high number of them fail, but then we were left with like a really interesting additional question, right? What does failure mean? Like, it's a tough thing to play on that, because does that mean the organization didn't get to something? Does it mean that the project didn't function at all? Does it mean it didn't function in the time frame that they had? I think I could go on and on and on with questioning why someone put a line in the sand and said you failed. It's like quitting, right? It's like you never, or like being a loser. You're never a loser until you decide you're no longer going to try anymore. So,
yeah.
So with that said, there are definitely ways to fail, and that maybe that's what you're driving towards, which I think is reasonable to talk about. What comes to mind? Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, what comes to mind is, what comes to mind really is Conway's law, which is to say that an organization, how an organization is organized, dictates how they deliver and what they deliver as far as software goes. And if you were to reverse that, if you were to look at it from a slightly different angle, one could claim that there's some requirements that you might have a need of in order to succeed, or at least to have your best foot forward. And one of those things would be culture, organization, and to be aligned, and to have a commitment where you have like everybody on board in the same direction, and they'll hold spar kind of thing. So to the extent that you're just like, you've got, it's like the, what, we could go back 15 years or whenever it was. I feel like I'm dating myself now, but you know, people were all on board, hungry to do Agile. And then, you know, 5 years after that, we're all failing with Agile. And first of all, what does that mean? Second of all, did you really commit to Agile, or does it look Agile-like? Like there's so many questions that come up in that regard. But I would say, you know, the ugly for sure would fall into, you know, making sure you have organizational alignment and that you're organized to be able to succeed in that way.
Now, I read something interesting that suggested that basically your software architecture should be almost like the blueprint for an organizational restructure, that you build your distributed application, and then you realign the organization structure to match that, basically to get in alignment, because I think it's harder to do it the other way around. If you, depending on how you're doing that. I mean, if you're in an older organization that is tasked with the dubious digital transformation initiative, and I mean, you almost have to do something like that.
Yeah, you know, not knowing again all the rules to that. Hold on, I gotta stop my robots from operating. But the challenge is, of course, in any, like, especially old school organization, something that's been around for a while, has had a history of any kind, is going to have legacy applications, and there's going to be multiple resistance, right? Like there's going to be this burden of needing to maintain the legacy as you move forward. There's going to be those that are aligned with that. There's definitely going to be a history that's going to cause some. So that you know, a lot of organizations have some success in, I hesitate to use the word, but going more skunk works on an initiative. Sometimes it's a realization, though, at a strong organizational level, and I think those are successful. I think the easy example would be like Twitter. You know, that I don't agree with a lot of their assessment when Twitter failed, or you know, had a history of failures with the fail well and all that other stuff. But one thing that they did do was they fully committed to go microservices. They fully committed to move from Ruby to Java. That's the part that I think you could succeed in multiple languages. I don't know if that's as relevant. And then they moved completely into, because they went microservices, they also added in Mesos, or essentially you could define it as container orchestration. So all of that happened at the same time, and the organization did succeed. But they have a risk model or business model, which is not as challenging as many.
And, you know, a really interesting comment just came in the chat from Emma. Said, but organizational restructuring happens all the time. Does that mean you have to rewrite your software? And it might be worth, and I don't know if you want to start with kind of a summary of what Conway's law is.
Yeah, let me pull it up real quick. I think I have a. So Conway's law, I'm finding a source, right? So it's probably been misquoted or requoted a number of times, however, but any organization that defines a system, defined more broadly here than just information systems, will inevitably produce a design whose structure is copy of the organization's communication structure. So it does come down to communication structure. And frankly, even though we call it Conway's law, right? It's a theory that someone applied and said, hey, I see this pattern consistently, and so I'm going to give it this here by name. Perhaps it's not a law. We could probably challenge that as well, but there's probably some patterns to it for sure. How you, like here, just software development as a whole, right? What does it mean to do fully Agile? And I don't want to change the subject too much and too radically, but briefly, what does it mean to do Agile? It means you got like everything you need on the same team, moving in the same direction, so that when you make some advancement in software, you're all on board with it. But does anybody really do that? Is that really true? It's rare to see that. I've been a part of that in some small teams where it's worked extremely well. It's super exciting to be a part of. But that is, in particular, is not the style that you see in a large organization. So what you see in this large organization is you have a team rapidly doing 2-week, 3-week, 1 week, or 1 month is common. Those are the common numbers of outputting something. But then they discover something multiple iterations in that makes some modifications, and for them, it's fine. For them, they learn something and they just evolve. But there's friction, right? And that friction doesn't exist when it's wholly owned by a team. It exists when you have multiple agile teams or scrums of scrums, however you want to call it, that need to collaborate and produce something. And that friction causes communication between those two teams, among other things. And so there's a need to understand that level of things. So you tend to break out components that way. You're like, oh, this is our security team, and the security team is going to do these things, and this is how we're going to communicate our applications to that team. You may have a database team. You may not. If you do, how you interact with the database is constrained in some way by some authority in that team. So there's no doubt that organizations and how organizations are organized has an impact on how we decide to communicate at a computer level, at a software level. So at least that's my assessment. One man's view. So
kind of bringing it back to the good, the bad, and the ugly then of microservices. And I'm searching for that source right now, but in your opinion and your experience, Kent, where do you see the problems arise? Because
mm-hmm.
I feel like microservices has sort of become, for better or worse, the perceived de facto best practice in software architecture. And I think a lot of where the ugly actually comes from, and where, however we end up defining failure, is that people tend to go into that unprepared. And if we could have one great takeaway from this webinar, I think it would be how to go into this architecture style fully prepared.
Yeah. Boy, I have like 1,000 thoughts. I don't know where exactly to start. I'll just start here.
I love it.
The CNCF has become a really great foundation that is bringing together like cloud native and cloud experiences, usually around Kubernetes, but generally has some really great stuff, and it's fairly well governed. Within that, they actually sent out a poll, and they're like, hey, what are your challenges for deploying containers? So they literally asked, so this is a response from the people who are at least connected to CNCF and are willing to take the poll. So, there's a discount on this a little bit, but in some ways it's super valuable information. In the top 3 of challenges, the very top one is cultural changes with development team. The second one is security, and the third one is complexity. So we could break those down if interested, but what does it mean to have cultural changes? What does it mean? And this becomes this is literally what I meant in part of the answer when talking about restructuring or looking at your organization. And there's a real human component to this, right? Like there's logic, and then there's the heart, and you can't leave it out. We're all one human. So with that said, first of all, I think you absolutely have to have an infrastructure that supports microservice-based architecture. I don't know how to do it otherwise. If you did it, it's very laborious. It's very challenging. But so that means putting in Kubernetes, Mesos, some Tupperware. Depends on what organization you are. You're going to come up with something. So in Google, there is either the Borg or Omega. If you're large enough, you might have your own, like Facebook does, and like what Google does, or you're an organization that doesn't specialize in that, and you don't want to invest in that. You're going to use what's available. That'd be Kubernetes and Mesos or DCOS. So you need that infrastructure. It's a core component, but that is where we start to have friction, right? And the friction is, it's most things that we do in software is evolutionary. Almost everything is. In fact, the thing that people ask for is, I want a faster horse. They're not asking for a car. They can't even think of it at that time. They just want a faster horse, or I want to be able to feed and water my horse while we're going, so I don't have to stop so often, or something along those lines. And the reality is moving from a statically partitioned data center into an extremely agile orchestration-oriented container orchestration world is so wholly different. It is a true movement also from pets, machines are pets, to machines are cattle. It's a shift in mentality, it's a shift in ownership. But here's the truth of it, right? The truth of it is my entire ops team has to relearn everything. Like that's what we mean by revolutionary, right? Like the people who were using Puppet and Shift and controlled whatever the GRE is and when we decide to patch things, all of that was in their control. And now they're left with all kinds of questions. Wait a minute, instead of having 1,000 recipes for machines in the data center, I have like 10. Now what am I going to do? I've lost control. Now all of a sudden the JRE is determined by somebody who created a Docker instance, and I didn't decide that. And all of a sudden, what do I control? And so there's this, and the reality is as soon as you start treating the data center as cattle instead of pets, now you literally, our experience is that you need less ops people. You just do. So now there's a fear of losing job. There's a fear of like, is there even a reason to re-up my game or re-up my skills or level up, right? Like, am I still going to be useful? Of course they are. Like I have no doubts there, but those are the real human, reactions that happen. That's the real resistance, and it's a real challenge. I feel like I've only answered part of the question, but that's where my head immediately went. Is when you look at the number one issue is like, well, this is this alignment with dev and this cultural shift and change. You get into Twitter and they're happy. Like the risk model is so low. The challenges are around security, things like that. But you get into a pharmaceutical place, or you get into healthcare in any way, you get into fiscal responsibilities in any way. The models completely change. And are you willing to take that risk? And if you kind of hesitate to use the word, but if you only half-ass it, you're like, in other words, you look like you're doing Agile, but you're not really doing Agile. So if you look like you're doing microservices because you're doing Docker, but you're not really, I could see that as a failure for sure. And you need full alignment. I'm not sure how you can get past that, right? And in some ways, here's the other challenge, right? It's I can tell you, I have good experience with transforming an organization into microservice-based architectures. And you have a lot of people who might say the same thing. They act the same way. They look the same way. They got the badge, right? And they think they can. They've not done it. But there's a lot of hope. And the kind of hope you're looking for is by the time you transition an entire infrastructure, you're not talking about a sprint. You're talking about a roadmap that can be significant. So you are as an organization. If I were in the C-suites, and I'm looking at this and you're asking me to spend millions, I've got questions and concerns and you're asking me to trust you. So there's lots of.
And that segues really nicely into a question that's come up in the chat. So the question is, this is from Emma. Also, could you talk a little bit about migrating a monolith to microservices? We've started doing that and it's been a lot harder than expected. And now I'm wondering if we should have just done a rewrite. Yeah. This is the perennial experience in my experience.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emma. That's fantastic. And I find that sometimes I don't always answer the question the way the person had mentally modeled it. And so keep challenging me if you're looking for something. I'll say one, there's not a silver bullet. There's not a just do X. So that doesn't exist. The other thing that I would add is as soon as you move into this model, if you didn't have it before, it's absolutely required. You need some level of governance. So that would be also on the list of things that you have to have. And we're not very good at it, or we traditionally, if I were just to be, this is challenging because I haven't seen all organizations, but in general, I don't get a good feel that we are great at it. I have seen some good organizations that have great governance. So that does exist. And I will add this. Do you need it? Why are you trying to do it? That's the real question, is why? You know what? The best way to answer this is to kind of tell a little bit of a story, and that is like one of the things I love at eBay is that they have a real discipline for what is their core business and what is not their core business. Of course, they have software in both those areas, but they have software in their core business and what's not their core business. And this was historically true. I don't know what they're doing today. It's been a while since I've read up on this and been aware of it. But in that world, they have a certain architectural discipline that's applied to their core business. The core business was auctions. And they built systems that were truly idempotent, which is insanely expensive. Like, it's hard. Most people don't fully understand how to get it right. But you could literally replay history because you were unaware an event happened and bad things happen and you don't know when it happened and you just want to replay, and you get the same exact result all the time, every time. That's idempotency. But that cost is way too high for user registration. User registration is not their core business. And even though they absolutely need people to register to be able to bid, they have fault tolerance at hardware levels, they have fault tolerance at software levels, but they explicitly choose to write stateful applications that are unlikely but possible to fail because it's cheap. It's insanely cheap. It's easy and cheap. And the maintenance is cheap. Whenever you build software, most people, this is governance again, but most people aren't looking at the full life cycle. They're not looking at, okay, the cost to build is only like a fraction of the software cost. The longevity, the maintenance, all the stuff that goes with it is super expensive as well. So when you look past that, you're like, well, if I invest cheaply for this thing that's not my core business, then it's also going to be cheap throughout, and I would rather have that cost. So the first thing is, just because you're going microservices doesn't mean all things need to be microservices. The first thing is, well, now you have to make a determination, should this be microservice or not? That's great. On the other point that Emma made, first of all, engineers are always, when they weren't the one that wrote the software in particular, they are always game for, we should rewrite this. But, so that's a hard one. That's a thing you have to balance. Because it might have been better. Frankly, whenever you have a monolith, in my opinion, whenever you have a monolith, in all likelihood, you will have to rewrite it. You're using it as inspiration, but in all likelihood, you have to rewrite it. There's all kinds of things, whether it's a 12-factor styles that weren't applied within it, where you're going to separate the monolith to be able to provide some kind of work within. And again, it comes down to why, right? If you're not able to scale the thing, if that's the concern, is it possible to horizontally scale the monolith and just jam it in a container and horizontally scale the thing if that works for you? It's so hard because without seeing, either the reasons why or the infrastructure, it's hard to have a right answer there. What do you think, Mike?
Well, one of the things I was just looking for was a slide from Mark Richards' workshop that he's been doing on the No Fluff virtual workshop series. I know you've got some as well coming up, but so Mark Richards did a half-day workshop on choosing the right architecture, and I think he also did the same content at UberConf earlier this year. But what he did was kind of talk broadly about different architecture styles, broke them into categories, monolithic and distributed, and talked about their relative strengths and weaknesses. And I don't think we have that conversation enough.
I love it.
The thrust of the talk was each of these has different strengths and different weaknesses.
Absolutely, so every time, yeah.
Start with the illity. Start with the architectural characteristics that are driven by the business, and then choose an architecture that's in alignment with that. I think the ugly is that there seems to be a rush towards microservices instead of saying, well, maybe this would be better as an event-driven system, or maybe this would be better as a service-based architecture, or maybe this needs to be a monolith. Monolith is not a pejorative, and it seems to have become that.
Yeah.
But again, none of these styles are inherently bad if they're in the most alignment with the business drivers. And again, coming back to that word that you have of governance.
Yeah, I love it. I think I would add to that conversation that There's different roles you're playing. And I don't think we talk about this enough as well. I think this is consistent with your message, is the different roles that we're playing. Sometimes we're doing R&D. We don't know something and we're questioning it. That R&D work could be engineering or business. And that's the other part of it, right? So in the business side, we're like, hey, I think this is a great idea. We can make money on this. What if we had a proof of concept that would identify whether this is a worthy thing to pursue or not? You throw something out, the users use it, they love it, great. Now you switch to the other role of engineering. You did not engineer something. You created your best effort at moving forward with an idea, which again, on the business side has two functions. One is, it's one decision point. Is this valuable, right? And it either goes one or two ways. Yes, we should engineer that, which they will, I've rarely seen anybody say, yes, let's engineer that. They just like, yes, give me more, yes, whatever. They make the mistake of thinking that a proof of concept or R&D project is production. It's not. But the other option is they pivot. They're like, this is shit, we should move on, right? Like, so they pivot completely away. You've learned something extremely fast, which is great. That's exactly what you're after. Again, on the technical end, you could be doing something for business, or you could be, I have no idea how to accomplish this thing. I don't even have a clue. And so then you create a proof of concept merely for your own benefit of understanding. And in the process of understanding, now you know. Once you know, you don't push that out to production either. Now you're like, okay, now that I know, how do I engineer and encapsulate this? How do I create a service? Does it make sense to make this a service? How does it fit? That kind of thing. That's what you're after. So the part that I commonly see a failure at, like, I don't know the percentage. I could make something up though. But what I commonly see is we push into production something that's not engineered. It's essentially what I would call R&D work, and it's driven by two different factors, business and dev. They have the same fallacies in that you're like, okay, now that I know, let's engineer a solution, which also drives to Emma's point, right? Like, let me continue that thought. Ideally, if you're doing a proof of concept, especially for the business, you're trying to answer a question, that should be a monolith. Why? It's insanely cheap. It's easy to understand. I'm gonna ask a question. I'm gonna answer that question. You should have the cheapest model to be able to produce an answer. Once you have the answer, now you engineer. Now it's still a choice, right? I agree with you, Mike, that that after you have the answer, you still have a choice. You still could build a monolith. In other words, it's not my core business. I want to make this as cheap as possible, or it's good enough, right? Good enough is good enough. What's funny to me, and I know I'm going in 1,000 directions, but what's funny to me is the statistics show that most data centers are 20% utilized. That means we have 80% of data centers not used. And the last two places that I've been to, they have 5% utilization, 5. So why the hell are we trying to optimize the data center in the ways that we're trying to do? We have plenty of capacity. Like, that is not the issue, right? But yet we're still very idealistically, driving down this path, and it's weird. It's weird to me. Now, could you benefit from it? Yeah, that's what Google is so far ahead of everybody, and part of the reason, I'm sure there's more to it than this, but part of the reason is they consider idle time or idle resources in the data center as evil. They from John Wilkes, that's literally came from him. So, which means that anytime they're not adding like search value or end user value, then there is cycles or resources being consumed and used for business benefit. They're doing the most advanced analytics possible. And, and you see these weird movements, and the weird movements look like this. To create their model, and this is again part of governance, but to create their model, what you would do is you would say, my business value, web search, is gonna be guaranteed reservation of 75%. And when they're only 30%, that means they're gonna fill the blanks between 30% and 75% with other work. But that work has to be, that has to be services that are invocable, revocable. You have to be able to reject. You have to hit the eject button. But that also means that if you got ejected as a process, you have to be able to come back. which means you also have to start where you left off, which means you also have to have checkpoints in place to be able to know where you left off so that you can start over again. So you need all that whole pattern in place in order to make that work. But what do we see in most organizations? What we see today in most organizations is we create multiple clusters. And we have a cluster that's wholly dedicated to analytics. And we have another cluster that's dedicated to microservices-based architecture. And we haven't even touched on like the level of maturity we could be at. We're still like crawling from an industry standpoint. And that sounds very arrogant. I definitely am not trying to come off that way. But like the things that are possible are just so much bigger than what we're currently, at in most organizations. And that's just where we're at. All right.
Incidentally, I did find the source of that stat, and so I misquoted it. And to your point, you were right on. Well, how do we define failure? So the actual quote, and this comes from a Gartner report. So verbatim, it is, quote, more than 90% of organizations that try microservices will find the paradigm too disruptive and use mini services instead.
Well, we got a new definition of a word, huh? Mini services.
Which I think mini services is something that is more. I interpret that to be something more akin to a SOA or service-based architecture, where you've got a lot coarser granularity, and I don't know. That's the actual stats.
It's fascinating. I'll have to look into that. I have a vision of Minnie Mouse, which is very cute, and that makes it friendly just by the mere fact that it's named Mini Service. So,
well, and
but then we're not gonna have compatible pieces, right? I'm gonna have a micro USB and a mini USB, and I'm not gonna be able to know what the hell I'm dealing with.
Well, let's not forget Nano Services. Apparently, that is a thing. Have you heard about this?
Oh, no.
I believe it's Amazon has thousands of Nano Services running on a single host. I think Nano Services are almost like in-memory
threads.
Maybe, I don't know. I know there's a good podcast on this, on service granularity. Now, interesting.
I will say,
I
will say that one of the challenges in the SOA days, there were two big challenges in the SOA days, right? One was ESB, which let's not talk about it. It's terrible. It's I don't know. It was misapplied probably most of the time. But the other was granularity services, which was your point. And defining the granularity of service was definitely problematic in those days. It's not a surprise. Actually, that was on my list of things. As far as it was on my bad list. On the bad list is all the failures in the SOA days are going to happen again in the microservices days. It's a lack of awareness, lack of understanding of the proper level of granularity necessary for a component to exist. You're not literally, you're not at a code level. You're not creating objects that talk to objects remotely. You still have encapsulation. You still have well-defined. And frankly, it raises the other concern, really big concern, is you have to get really, really good at versionable services. And generally speaking, we're not. You have to be able to have a version of a service in play, upgrade to another version of that said service. And then you have options, once again, which are usually driven by governance. Do I transform the communication when I'm talking to a V2 object from V1 to V2? Is that possible? And do I translate back? And in the Kubernetes world, we would call that a webhook, a transformational webhook. Or how do I manage that, right? Or do I just make breaking changes? And so the fact that we're not generally good at idempotency, certain architectural abilities we're not inherently great at. We don't have I just don't hear this in our news. Maybe it's my awareness, but we're not really great at versioning of services. So without that, you're likely to fail. So anyway.
Well, there's a lot of really good comments coming in the chat, and I'm going to pause just for one moment here and just let folks know. Let's see, right there, that ArcConf 2020 is happening. It's a virtual event, and if you really want to dive deep into all of these topics and the entire spectrum of skills that is necessary to be an effective software architect, I would highly recommend checking out ArcConf. Ken, I know you and I have been there many years. I think you and I have been to probably almost all of those, and this is the sixth ArcConf taking place, and some really great things coming up. One is that if you do register for ArcConf, your ticket includes the virtual event this year and a live ticket next year in 2021. There's already 70 in-depth 90-minute sessions on the schedule. And because of the format, we're going to have full audio visual chat, everything recorded and available for replay, as well as the slides and the discussions and everything else that really makes these events wonderful. So if you're interested, there is an early bird discount that expires on Monday. So it would be worth jumping at that. And not only that, but Ken, I know you've got some workshops and things coming up as well. If you go to nofluffjuststuff.com, you can see all of the virtual events that are taking place this year. We've got three general conferences, and then we've got 3 destination events, the Progressive Web Experience, Tech Leader Summit, and ArcConf. We've got a whole host of in-depth instructor-led, live, hands-on virtual workshops taking place almost every day of the week. Tons and tons of stuff coming up there. And then you can also see all of the webinars. Everything is on nofluffjuststuff.com. But just wanted to let folks know about that, and because it's definitely a resource to tap into. But there's some.
You know what? Not to jump the tracks because it's the last one that came in. I'm surely there's worthy questions that came before it. But Stephen, your comments around data. Dang, yeah. I mean, data plays a huge part. First of all, data is insanely expensive. It depends on where we're at, right? But I'm thinking cloud. It's expensive in the cloud. It's expensive to move for sure. It's almost impossible to. Again, you got to define the use case. But like we end up doing crazy things, meaning, you know, I'm forgetting the numbers, but the amount of data coming out of an automated car, let's say, it's in the terabytes, if not petabytes. So, and that's like per, I don't know, unit of time. It's definitely, let's just say it's a day. I think I'm way off, I'm way under. So with that said, you know, we summarize things, and then we're doing one or two things. We're either pushing to the edge. So you see some movement of microservice-based architecture where we're literally putting Kubernetes on airplanes now, and we're putting it in spacecrafts. We're doing some stuff that's fascinating. So we're moving execution closer to data, which is not a surprise. It's a smart thing to do because it's expensive and hard, and you almost have no bandwidth to move it the other direction. But then we're also pushing summations back, and you're doing processing on that. Data has such a huge impact on microservice-based architectures. I will add to that I think if you need, there's consistent in the thread is define for me a really good microservice-based architecture, right? And what I would say is there's not a silver bullet, so it's hard. I would claim this. Look at what Kubernetes is doing today. There are some things about it that I think are just amazing. It's just absolutely one of the best examples of doing it right in a number of categories. It's still evolving. There's still some deficiencies. There's still some things to work out. I agree on all those points. But what does it have? It has a very front-end API server. The API server is the gateway to all data. You can't get data, even inside the cluster, you can't get data unless you're going through the API server. So everything could connect directly to etcd, but it doesn't. It goes through the API server, which becomes the front end to a number of things. It has an extensible API. I can add new kinds, new types, new resources to it in a declarative way. I have ways of extending it that aren't like customizing the cluster or my instance of installation. It literally is something I can modify from the outside. It's part of the design. You have, like most people don't realize or understand this, but it's a series of controllers that manage the entire thing. And they have one small thing that they do, one small thing, and they do it extremely well. So when I might be talking out of school here because I don't know who we have online. I don't know if they're in the Kubernetes space. So forgive me for a second, but like if you deploy, if you will, a deployment, like the series of events is just fascinating. You have an entry into etcd through the API server, and you have something that's watching that data through the API server, which is a controller, the deployment controller. And the controller sees, oh, hey, this was what the world should be, but this is what the world is. Let me fix that. And the way I fix that is I say, oh, I need a replica set. And so it creates an instance through the API server of a replica set. And the replica set controller sees that there's a new instance of a replica set controller and says, hey, this is what the world says it should, this is what it's declared to be, this is what the world is, let me resolve that. And it says, oh, I need 3 pods because that's what the replica set says. And you can, it continues. There's a series of controllers that know one thing. Never does the deployment controller actually do anything with pods, ever. It doesn't do anything with pods. It does one small thing, it does it well, and it has a collaboration that happens. And the only thing that's different external to the cluster than internal to the cluster is internal you can do protobuf, which is a highly condensed messaging packet, versus externally, things are communicated through JSON. And there's talks right now of reducing that and changing it to protobuf. You know, and this is a brilliant evolution. Hey, you got JSON, deal with it. Oh, is that the bottleneck? Okay, well, let's just transform that then to protobuf. It's the same thing. Let's just make it easier for everybody, or faster for everybody. Now that is a control plane, and it's dangerous. It is a control plane, which is, in my thinking, is easier than an application. But the same principles are there. They have versionable APIs. They have a version of storage. When I have something that's V1 and I move to V2 beta 1, it actually stores it either in V1 or V1 beta 2, or V2 beta 1. And then all the controls are there. All the controls. It's really brilliant. And then to go further on the data point, that's why Kafka is so popular. I have streams of data going into and then going out of and creating a repository of data that was the truth, you know, from the truth of source, but it is not the truth of source, or the source of truth, which I think is brilliant. I think that, you know, there's a reason why Kafka has become insanely popular. It's because we actually want all the data, but it's too it encumbers the services too much. You want to be able to do something. Now that something could be write intensive or read intensive. With most applications being read intensive, eventual consistency works extremely well, and I can just federate it across and pump data as I go. It's awesome. So I went on a...
No, I think that's great. And to your point, honestly, I believe the data problem of microservice architectures is one of the hardest problems to solve. That as soon as you start sharing data, well, you're losing the key benefits of what microservices give you. And, you know, I to quote Mark Richards, he says, if somebody says that you can never, ever, 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 ever share data between microservices, he says, I'll show you show me somebody who says that, and I'll show you somebody who's never actually built microservices in the real world. And so I know Mark talks about data domains as a potential solution. And then Mark Addison here is talking about CQRS as well, especially for splitting those read and write workloads to your point. But I know we're running low on time, and I want to pivot just a little bit to Mark Addison's other comment here that I think would be just a real nice way to wind up this webinar. He says, as this was the good, bad, and ugly of microservices, what are characteristics of good microservices? And the examples he gives are scale, size, and granularity, encapsulation of specific functionality, communication. He says, e.g. via messaging system. Does it need to be an event messaging system? Assumption that these must be asynchronous, and acceptance of things like eventual consistency. So there's there's a lot there, and I'd love to talk about the good, and then maybe close with Brian's question here as well. But we'll get to that in a minute. But I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah. You know, where I get into trouble oftentimes in these conversations is really around what model are we talking about. And as much as I love and respect Mark, and frankly, any of the other people we want to quote, whether it's Fowler or, you know, we could go through the list of really, really smart people. It's often also easy to catch a quick little quip or a phrase that doesn't always match on all use cases, but matches on either the majority or their experience or whatever that is, right? And that in no way is meant to be, I think they would agree with that, actually. I do, I hope so anyway. So with that, you know, like what would be the proper way to create like an architecture which allows me to get stock trades at real time and have no latency or as little as possible. That system is like even the data element of it is so wholly different than I need a cart, you know, I need to be able to buy something, or, you know, or an expert-based system where I have drugs that are coming through and I need to see, is there a prescription and are there drugs that were delivered to this household that would have interacted with this drug in a very negative way. And so now I need a lot of, I would say, cached experience or cached expert data that is easily accessible and real time. In some ways, real time is necessary. You know, it really comes down to how real time are you, whether eventual consistency works in your environment. Like, I would not want to make trade decisions on a system that is eventual consistency.
Mhm.
You know, so and that is a really freaking hard problem. Except for, you know, it's not hard to stream the same, you know, a stream of data. That part is not hard. Okay, so then you could go from there. So. What is good? Well, I think, you know, that was a large conversation to say it depends. It depends on your use case in so many different ways. If you have an event-oriented system, yeah, event bus likely makes sense, or event messages. If you have a need to disconnect where I have real time or not, it depends on also the user experience you want to have. You know, can the user experience tolerate the fact that I requested something and they get a response that says, you will get, you know, your answer will come in an email and within the day. If that is tolerable, you should do it. Like, that's awesome. Those are the kind of things. Like, the system you would build to control something extremely real time, like decisions on whether the rocket should terminate midair or go to impact. That's huge, man. Like, that's a wholly different thing. So I probably you know, probably said that enough. What I see is this, and it's actually been consistent through my career. It's really about the maturity of organizations and maturity of software. So the first thing that you have is something that's functional. And in some ways it's either R&D or engineering. I don't know. You can decide for yourself what that is. But the next evolution is, oh yeah, I gotta be able to maintain this thing. So I need to be able to have metrics or logging or access to that. And the next level beyond that gets to be things like, I need to have analytics. So where are people really spending their time? Where are the bottlenecks? I need to have some profiling and things of that nature. And then you can go through governance and such. If you talk about microservices in general, though, the good would include, you have to land on a container orchestration system. I don't know how you don't do that, actually. And it comes with its own problems, right? Like, if you go into container orchestration and you're using containers, there are security challenges, and you have to know those, and you have to know, okay, what's the threat model? And that said, you know, I can't say the name, but, you know, the US government, where we would have huge concerns about security, uses Docker in their backend data center. So, you know, the interrogation of security happens at another layer. It doesn't happen, let's say, node to node, or it doesn't happen process to process. It happens at a layer above that. So knowing, it comes down again to knowing your infrastructure, knowing what your concerns are, knowing how to manage those concerns. But step one, I can't imagine not being on a container orchestration environment if you want high agility and high capacity. It also depends on on your risk models, right? Like, I love, for some organization, let's use Twitter as an example. You might have dev, production, and QA all in the same cluster. And a lot of organizations, what the hell, I would never do that. Well, it's really just a matter of managing your traffic. You don't send production traffic to anything other than production, and then you're good. Like, it's fine. And what does that enable them to do? It enables them to have a football Super Bowl moment, or a Black Friday moment, and to eliminate all non-essential traffic, and to have the largest production environment that they've ever had, right? Like, and that stretches your imagination of what's possible, which is awesome. That's cool stuff. Now, maybe some organizations in a multi-tenant world don't feel comfortable with that. Again, that's a really human thing. That's not a technical thing. It's a human thing. They don't feel comfortable. Okay, well, get familiar enough to become comfortable with it. The next evolution as soon as you have container orchestration is it's a whole new world. How do you debug that thing? How do you modify it? Which comes down to metrics. You're probably going to need Prometheus, Grafana. You're going to need something to monitor and understand, and then you're going to need to have the technological prowess to get into a container and unstick it or move it along or understand it and evaluate it, that kind of thing. So those two things are hit core to me on good. Those are the things I think are foundational, I guess. But that probably is not satisfactory to a number of people. They want to know what they can do to their app. Well, the best thing you can do for your app is to understand, how that infrastructure works, how to manage security around that infrastructure, and then how to enable that. And then, of course, it's the same stuff. We've been talking about it for a decade or longer. 12-factor, really good ideas and concepts. Probably security that's the thing with security. You could go multifaceted, right? Like there's cross-cutting. I'm gonna use GWT or something. It depends on your environment. Maybe you're forced to use Kerberos. There's something, right? There's some way of managing tokens and credentials and authorization, such. I mean, you could go further, but that I think is where we're at with most organizations is getting there and understanding. And that, okay, I'll go one step further, and that is, again, governance, but it means classification of applications, which drives to things like affinity and anti-affinity. If I need to be able to define what are my fault domains, what are my upgrade domains, what things do I have affinity to, what are my precious resources, like GPUs, maybe in the cloud? How do I reserve my precious resources for the things that need them and not just random things? How do I guarantee affinity of pod to pod? Potentially you have close working either data and execution that you need to land in the same nodes. What is anti-affinity? The fact that I have 2 or more versions of Kafka, but I never, you would be, depends on the resource, but in general, it's a bad idea to have 2 instances of Kafka on the same node. Let's just put it that way. And it has nothing to do with what it's an identification that there's greater resources than just CPU and memory. Whenever you have memory pressure, you have paging to disk that happens, and you can consider memory paging to disk a resource. And if you have multiple things contesting that at the same time, it's bad. Like, again, all of those things are under the umbrella of extremely high scale. Under extremely high scale, you just have different problems to solve. You may not see it. You could have 2 Kafkas that are idle on the same node. That's fine. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that's where my mind is right now.
Well, and I think part of the challenge is there aren't absolute answers to any architecture questions, right? I mean, unless the absolute answer is it depends. But we're about out of time. We're coming up on the top of the hour. Brian just commented an interesting idea that I've seen a lot. He says, would you agree there can be value in developing a greenfield app first as a monolith, and then once the team has a decent grasp of where the domain and subdomain boundaries are, then begin carving off slices as microservices?
Yeah, I'm 100%. I thought I even said that, so I'm 100% on board with that. I think, well, first of all, if you're trying to solve a problem and you haven't solved it before, take the easiest path to get there, and that would be monolith. Past that, then you got to ask the questions. Well, if we carve this off, why am I carving it off? What value is it bringing? One would assume that you have a service within that monolith that could be leveraged and used in other services, which is great, super smart. And Mark, thanks for the hit on the. I get you. We can have some debates and conversations around trading systems, but valid point. You still have to guarantee idempotency, and latency has a huge impact. And those that have least latency, there's without question, there's different qualities of service of data. And that quality of service usually is the timeliness of the information provided. And it's only the very, very large organizations, lots of money, that get the highest quality of service. It's the ordinary news and everyday people that get a lower quality service, and there's a reason. So I think we can at least agree on that.
And then,
Yeah, playing the devil's advocate. Yeah, awesome.
and M asks, where does UI fit in?
Uh, I'm a back end guy.
Yeah. Although I
Yeah.
will say that the ThoughtWorks has, for a few editions of the technology radar, moved micro front ends all the way into the adopt ring. But we've got to wrap up. We're coming up to the top of the hour. Ken, I want to leave you with the last words. Just anything you feel that you didn't get to communicate, anything that you feel would be important to emphasize, anything like that.
Yeah, that's tough. I had a number of thoughts that came to me that I didn't even, and I wouldn't have time to even share. With that, you know what, first of all, I'm available to a certain extent, and most people haven't even tapped into that. Not that I'm the source, but I love to collaborate on these things. I don't know if there's a right answer. So if you go to K8s.io Slack, I'm there every day, or you can hit me off on Twitter and that kind of thing. I'd be happy to collaborate, I guess, until I can't or won't. Yeah, I don't know. That said, this is hard. Look, I think there is an irrational exuberance towards new shiny things. This is the new shiny thing of the last couple of years. I think the problems that we need to solve are consistent to the same problems we had for the last 20 years. At least my involvement in that. And there's not an easy, simple one way. It takes really knowing your constraints. It really comes down to that. It also comes down to people, which I could talk at length about, but having good, high quality people, understanding the Dreyfus model that you're on, understanding how to make each individual a contributing member in a successful way, that matters. But really understanding your domain, really understanding your constraints, and then providing solutions around that, that's the end game. If I would love to get your feedback. If there's something I missed, if there's something that you really felt passionate about and it wasn't said, clearly it's an hour. It's what we had. With that, I thank you. It's been a fun time. I'm happy to. This is great. One of my favorite things about software is this beautiful combination of science and art, and oftentimes we don't recognize both of them. Right? They both are true. We can artfully look at creative solutions, but we can't forget the science of metrics and monitoring and the actual good design and engineering. And it's really hard. So hopefully, kudos to you guys for having the interest in joining us and having a conversation around it. I apologize that we didn't have more of a Q&A session. It's just a chat. It would have been great to actually have a good conversation around this with others. Thank you.
Well, I just dropped it's K8s.io. It's the Slack there, and then I dropped your Twitter handle in there as well, and a lot of great stuff. So once again, Ken, thank you so much, and for everybody who's joined us here for this, thanks very much. We do these every week. We do on average 15 to 20 trainings every month as well. These are all live. And folks of Ken's caliber for sure, as well as the conferences. So you can check all that out at nofluffjuststuff.com. And with that, I will say thank you, folks. Have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend. Yes, stay safe out there, everybody.